Hello, and welcome to Why It Matters Integration Unraveled, a Blueprint 1543 podcast. I'm Rebecca Dorsey, co founder and vice president of Blueprint 1543. At Blueprint, our mission is to support the development of integrated people, integrated churches, and integrated inquiry to help people ask and answer some of life's biggest questions using the tools of the sciences and the Christian faith. The goal of this podcast is to ask, why does integration matter in each of these areas? In everyday sciencey people's lives, in churches, and in scholarly inquiry. Today, I'm joined by my colleague and longtime friend, Dr. Ian Church, and he's potentially an integrated person doing integrated inquiry. I say potentially because we're going to go behind the scenes today and hear how he's really approaching some of his interesting and maybe integrated work to see for ourselves by the end. So, Ian, as we get started off here, I would just love to go back in time a little bit to how we met. And as we get sort of teed up to talk about how we met, can you share a few of the titles that you currently hold in life?
Yeah, so I am an associate professor of philosophy at Hillsdale College. I'm also the director of the Arate Research Center for Philosophy, Science, and Society. I'm also a husband and a father.
Okay, those are a couple of excellent titles in there. Now, if we go way, way back to the very beginning of how we first met, do you remember what our first actual interaction was between you and I?
Yeah, so there are a couple of memories that come back immediately, and unsurprisingly, they have to do with my anxiety. During the Skype interview, because I was interviewing for the position at Fuller with the Science of Intellectual Humility Project, and I remember there was a dog in the room where I was interviewing, and
Oh,
this
no.
was a bulldog, and the bulldog kept farting and licking himself. And so I was deeply distracted by that and very, very concerned that might come through.
Now, how was there a dog in the room when you were doing a job interview?
Well, because I didn't have like a really good internet access, and so I had to find a place that would have good internet access at that time. And it just so happened that they had a dog that was hanging around in the living room, and apparently the dog ate something that didn't quite agree with him. So I remember that. I remember utilizing one of my favorite methods for dealing with anxiety during interviews, right? So my supervisor in grad school knew I was really anxious, and especially when it comes to interviews, trying to plan for everything that could be asked.
Right.
And he told me that, look, no matter how much you prepare, there's always going to be some sort of question that comes out of left field. And so, so you just know that's going to happen. And so instead of being paralyzed when that happens, he said to just sort of train to change the dynamics about how that you receive that question. And so he said to turn it into a drinking game.
Yeah.
And you don't have to use whiskey or anything like that. You can use just, water or coffee, whatever you fancy. But if a really difficult question comes by, you think, oh, that's a really good question. You say that, and then you go, no, let me just think for a second. You take your drink and then you just go for it, right? So it just changes that dynamic of, oh no, I'm not going to know the answer to this, to just all I can do. This is part of the game, and all I could do is just do my best. And so I remember all that sort of going into the interview.
I can just only hope that I caused you single-handedly enough, let me take a sip of water moments to have caused a really fun day for you. Wow. See, I don't actually remember your interview. Sorry.
Well, I also remember giving a hopelessly romantic, rationalist view about how to deal with disagreements, because I remember you guys were asking about how to handle disagreements in the workplace. And, I sort of was doggedly committed to following reason wherever it went, and so on and so forth. And if we could just coolly and rationally, everybody just sort of share where they're coming from, then everything's going to be fine. But anyway, I remember, those are some of the things I remember from our first interaction.
That is so fun. The behind the scenes, I had no idea about the farting dog in the room or about the drinking game that may or may not have involved water.
Yes.
Or coffee. And I just think that that's It's so fun to hear
Yeah.
the behind the scenes of when you first meet people and what they're thinking. Now, my first real distinct memory of interacting with you was actually your very first day. Because for those who weren't there, Dr. Ian Church worked at the research center where I started my time working in research centers, and you were, of course, very on the ball, very proactive, and it asked what time and where you needed to be for your first day. And people who know me know that mornings and I just don't really have a great relationship. Every morning is a struggle. And I had a 7 to 8 minute, or my snooze was 8 minutes at that time. And so I was always 7 minutes late to work. And because I would hit snooze one too many times every day, it was a thing. And I just remember, I was like, okay, it's Ian's first day. Everybody's always early on their first day. It's this really irritating, responsible habit that people have when you're the manager who has to,
Right.
be there and be looking professional when they arrive. And so I remember coming out of my apartment because I didn't live very far from our office at that point and walking to campus and seeing what I was pretty sure was you up like a half a block in front of me and just being like, oh, man, how am I going to get around this guy so that I can beat him up the stairs? Maybe he'll take the elevator and I can run the stairs, and trying to beat you to my office, which I failed at. You were standing at my office door when I got there. And I was like, oh, this responsible person who was
Sorry.
early. And I even tried to be actually on time that day and not my 7 minutes late. So that's, my first memory of us. And from there, I was back in, I guess, 2012.
Yeah.
And we are now in 2024. A lot of life has happened between now and then.
Yeah.
And you have come to mind when we were thinking about who could we talk to about integrated inquiry? Who are some people we know that are integrating the position of faith and the place that they come from with the work that they do in meaningful ways and in their scholarship, and combining work from different disciplines in really interesting and meaningful ways. So, of course, you came to mind, and I would love to dig into some of what your professional and personal life has looked like around the ideas of integration
Yeah.
in the decade plus that we've at least known each other. We started at our first connection and first day, but let's go back to the very beginning of Velocirapting. What made you interested in philosophy as a profession?
Yeah. So I became a Christian when I was 16 years old, and um, I made the mistake of thinking that the only way for me to be a good Christian is to either be a missionary or to be a pastor. And given that I have a tremendous number of allergies to the outside world, I thought the missionary field was probably not the best bet for me. And so I thought I would start thinking about being a pastor. And so while I was still in high school, I would go to seminaries and think about what I should study in college as a prep for work in seminary. And repeatedly, philosophy came up as one of those fields that would be a good sort of prepper for studying at seminary. But along with that, I was already independently interested in philosophy because I was, as a new Christian at that point, I was really interested in questions about how do we know whether or not God exists? What are some arguments for and against, so on and so forth. And so, religious epistemology, if you will, was something that I was really interested in from day one. But then along with that, I feel like I should mention this because it might sort of tie into the integration story. I was raised by psychologists, and I still remember them bringing home games for me to play as a child.
Now, for those who couldn't see you, you just did air quotes on games. Do you want to
Yeah.
break that one down for us?
Yeah, so it was sort of memory tests, intelligence tests. My parents would gauge my IQ, and they knew early on that I was not particularly good at directions, all this kind of stuff. And so, all sorts of things that were sold to me as games that were actually just sort of cognitive tests.
Uh-huh.
And so eventually I ended up really disliking psychology, actually, and when it had nothing to do with it. And so, part of the attraction to philosophy for me was also, it was something that was different from what my parents had done. And two of my grandparents got their PhDs in psychology. So there's a sort of history of doing work in psychology in my family. And so I was going to try to buck that trend. And so anyway, that's sort of what led me to philosophy. And then, when I started taking philosophy classes, when my freshman year, first semester, I took Introduction to Philosophy, and I took Logic, which was the Philosophy 200 class, which was taught by the late great Tom Foster. And I absolutely fell in love with philosophy, I for its own sake. I remember just how the philosophers were able to see through what I felt like were some of the postmodern gobbledygook that had permeated higher ed. But philosophers weren't sort of under that spell. Philosophers were able to see through some of the problems with the kind of naive relativism that had permeated higher education. And I just really appreciated the concern for truth that philosophers had, and just really, really appreciated it as a field.
Yeah. So I can see you really stuck it to your family then by having no professional interactions with psychologists or psychological research in any.
Yeah, Rebecca. Well, so the Lord has a sense of humor, it seems, because my very first job was working at the Fuller Graduate School of Psychology with you and Justin Barrett. And I fell in love with it. I just fell in love with the interactions that philosophy could have with psychology, and I was genuinely annoyed by it. I was annoyed by how much I appreciated how psychology could be useful for updating my philosophizing, and how philosophy could be useful for the psychologist in their pursuit of empirical research. And so, I was hooked very early on into the project of integration.
Yeah, I feel like the book title there is Annoyed by Integration, or Integration by Ironic Annoyance,
Yeah,
something along those lines.
the unwilling integrationist,
Yes, the
something along those lines.
unwilling and irritated
Yeah, right.
integrationist. I love
Yeah,
the passion that came out as you shared that frustration with how much you actually liked it.
yeah.
So, can you walk us through just a very uh, brief explanation of what it is that you actually do now?
Yeah. So right now, I'm the principal investigator of the Launching Experimental Philosophy of Religion project. And this is a project that aims to sort of essentially create a new area of research called experimental philosophy of religion. And what that is it's the project of taking the tools and resources of the human sciences, so psychology, cognitive science, sociology, and others, and bringing them to bear on questions within philosophy of religion. And so this is sort of I think a good example of integration in my life at this point. And so we're coming to the last couple months of this project, but it's been very much a fruitful project, and it's been exciting to see what we've been doing.
Okay, so experimental philosophy already right there. Is that something you would feel is integration? This is a genuine question.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think so. I mean, but it's a complicated question, right? So, because part of what I want to say is that philosophy has, in some sense, always been integrated.
Okay.
And so the story I like to tell is that, going back to the pre-Socratics through Aristotle on through, the medieval philosophers who were working on practical philosophy, up through Descartes and Locke and Hume and so on and so forth, there's this sort of close relationship between the philosophies and the sciences. And there's not really the sharp divide that we now see in higher education. And in fact, it's really that divide between the sciences and philosophy and the humanities is a modern invention. It's a product of governing higher education, and it's not sort of an intellectual conclusion that we need to accept out of the gate. It's something that's sort of just been a practical result of the way higher education has evolved. And so in a way, philosophy's always been integrated. Philosophy's always been interested in those kinds of questions, the big questions that can't be answered purely from the armchair. And so I think experimental philosophy is in some ways a traditional mode of doing philosophy. But again, when we're thinking about in terms of modern concepts of philosophy and psychology, it's definitely going to be an integrated practice. We're using empirical tools to study questions that had, at least recently, been predominantly answered from the armchair, answered from purely theoretical perspectives.
Okay. So that launched into how the field of philosophy is, perhaps by its very nature, this integrated type of work. But if we back up a couple of steps and just say, in general, what would be your first response that comes to mind if I asked you, why does it matter to do integrated inquiry?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple different reasons for having integrated inquiry. I mean, one is, as you might have already sort of picked up on, is I think there's if you value the tradition of Western thought, then I think this is integration is the story of the Western philosophical tradition. And so if you use that as being normatively guiding, right, as telling us how we should sort of order our own inquiries, then I think that gives us a good historical reason to continue to do integrated research. But another sort of argument that I'd give for integration is I think most of the big questions that we're interested in life and certainly within philosophy can't be addressed from a single discipline. And so, for example, if I wanted to give you a philosophy of human life, right, or philosophy of human nature, it seems sort of absurd to think that I would just do that without ever looking at humans, right? To do that purely theoretically without ever looking in the mirror, looking at other humans, so on and so forth. That seems like a really bad way to try to give a philosophy of how humans should live, or a philosophy of human nature. And so, the big questions really have to be done from an interdisciplinary kind of engagement. Now, as we've progressed in higher education, as fields have become more and more complex, it's become, I think, pretty much impossible for anyone to be an expert in everything, right? But I think we have a lot of room for collaboration, where you have people who are experts in different fields working together and able to, through that collaboration, get at a much better picture of the world overall. And another reason for integration that I'm sort of attracted to myself is that I think integration gives you a much more healthy epistemology. All right, it gives you a healthier way of understanding the truth and being sensitive to evidence, whatever it happens to be. Right. So take the cliche that all truth is God's truth. Right. Well, I think if we accept that, then I think that frees us up to find truths wherever they happen to be, and to let our epistemology account for those truths. Right. So, for example, one historical example I like to point to here is the fact that in some places in the Bible, it looks like, right, people for a while thought it said that the earth is unmoving, right, that the earth is unmoving. And then, so from their perspective, the Bible suggests that a geocentric or earth-centric picture of the universe, of the solar system. But now, as we've progressed in astronomy, we are now seeing that's clearly not true. That interpretation of what the Bible is saying is not the accurate interpretation, because we now know the Earth orbits the sun. And so this is sort of an episode in the history of philosophy, the history of science, that I think is familiar to lots of us. But it's a really important episode because it shows that an integration of science with philosophy and philosophy and religion that makes perfect sense to us. I think few of us would fail to side with Galileo or Copernicus at this point in history, and we can see that kind of integration is exactly the right way to proceed, and it's a healthy way to have our body of knowledge updated by the evidence wherever we might find it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really fun.
I should point out I've got some pictures of, I think it's Copernicus. Got to get my Copernicus there and Galileo there. Yeah.
Okay, and for those who couldn't see, Ian was very professionally pointing behind him at the items and artwork on the wall there. Yeah. Now, one of the things that you shared about is that you are a faculty member and you are at a teaching institution, as I understand it.
Yep.
So, how do you help students think about some of these integration points for or against, whether it's in the philosophy work that they're doing, whether it's just in other areas of their life, or even incorporating in their positions of faith, whatever that may or may not be?
Yeah.
How do you help students work through some of these things?
Well, I try to make the case that this kind of integration is the core of what the liberal arts is all about. So Hillsdale is a classical liberal arts college. We live and breathe integration. And I think it's precisely the environments like Hillsdale that allow for a deep type of integration where you have people who are experts in different fields, but we're all working in the same sort of area, same sort of, area and space. That so we can interact with each other in a deep way, and we can sort of foster relationships and friendships, because that's really part of it as well, right? It's very difficult to try to speak across different disciplines because oftentimes people have different ways of talking and different rules that they're playing by when they're doing their research. And so I try to tell students that this kind of integration is what they've signed up for, right? The liberal arts is all about asking these big questions about the human experience and how we should live. But again, we can't do that from any one discipline. We need to look at the philosophy. We need to look at the history. We need to look at the science to give any sort of a halfway decent understanding of a halfway decent answer to the questions of how we should live.
Yeah, yeah. What kind of a response do you get?
Oh, they're nerdy, and they love the liberal arts, so they know what they're signing up for. So it's usually pretty excited to see these kinds of things. But there can be some pushback, right? So you might worry. So there might be some objections. I've heard some people sort of give aesthetic objections to the kind of integration I'm most interested in using empirical tools to answer sort of religious or philosophy of religion questions. They think that there's something unbecoming of doing that for whatever reason. I haven't quite gotten my head around that objection, but there's also sort of maybe a related concern that the tools of the sciences are not the kinds of tools that are useful for doing theology and religion. And so there might be pushback there, or there might be pushback to say that, there's the what we can measure using empirical tools is always going to be disconnected in some way from what theologians and philosophers of religion are most interested in. There's going to be I call it the measurement problem, a gap between what we can measure and what the philosophers and theologians are most interested in. And so I think those are some of the objections that can and do come up, and what we talk about in the classroom as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned then a little bit of some of the disconnect that can come up. What does this look like practically on the ground? How does it play out in a discussion among multiple disciplines, or when you're working on a project and you've got people coming from these different perspectives?
Yeah.
What does that look like on the ground?
Well, so I remember when I first started collaborating with psychologists, and I remember being struck by, we were all speaking English, but we were meaning different things by the words that we were using, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's all sorts of, norms that end up permeating our interactions, our professional interactions. And so, for example, this is obviously going to be, overgeneralization, painting with a broad brush, but in general, psychologists tend to be much more polite sounding than philosophers, right? They're very accommodating, very friendly, typically. Even if they hate a paper, they might think, well, have you thought about doing this, and so on and so forth, right? It's very sort of a fresh, friendly framed kind of interactions. But philosophers, especially analytic philosophers, which is where I'm coming from, my own trainings within analytic philosophy, they tend to have more of a reputation for being, let's see, blunt, and sort of sometimes asking sort of extreme questions just to try to get at sort of the parameters of what's being talked about. But when you try to find those extreme parameters, it sounds like you might be framing some just crazy crazy questions. And so that can sort of lead to some uncomfortable interactions, I've found. And one of the metaphors I like to give here is that interdisciplinary engagement can sometimes feel like you think you're sitting down to play a game of chess, right? You got the pieces out in front of you, you got your opponent showing up, and then they pull out a bag of dice. And you think, what game are you playing? Because I'm playing this game. And I thought we were agreeing to play this game, but clearly you're bringing other things to this game that I didn't think that we were supposed to be bringing to this game. And so it takes time and it takes goodwill to try to figure out what everybody is doing and how to understand what everybody else is doing, and how to, respond to objections, how to respond to feedback, and how to understand, where people are coming from in their own research, and how to sort of best draw from that and contribute back into that field.
Now that sounds very understandable, but still a little bit abstract. Can you give an example of that without throwing any colleagues fully under a moving bus or freight train?
Yeah, I mean, so for example, there would be conversations about like belief. Right? Both philosophers and psychologists are really interested in belief.
Okay.
But the way philosophers and psychologists talk about belief is different. And so belief, philosophers might think of belief as sort of an epistemic state that's almost a conceptual primitive. But psychologists, then that's not how they're really concerned about those things. They're thinking about sort of maybe affirmations or agreement or levels of levels of agreement, something along those lines. Or they might sort of think about an empirical state that they're then labeling. That's what a belief is to have this kind of interaction. And so trying to figure out how to translate those different sort of uses of belief. And I also found that one of the things that was sort of funny to me is how and again, I'm speaking, this is me sounding very much like a philosopher, how bizarrely traditional psychology seemed to be to me. And so, there was a study that we were talking about that we were wanting to build upon. And I remember asking questions about, that the empirical methods that were being used in that previous study. And I didn't think that they were particularly good and so on and so forth. And they weren't sort of theoretically well established. But, psychology is, as I was told at the time, was that it's very traditional insofar as you tend to use what's already been established as good tools. And even if you sort of see serious problems with those tools, you're better off to just keep using that tool and for your own purposes. You're going to be more likely to be published if you do that than if you try to reinvent the wheel. It's going to be a more of an uphill battle. And so anyway, trying to understand some of those dynamics was a part of the experience for me.
Mm-hmm. So if we flip the question around a little bit, then what makes all that extra time and effort worth it? Or is there an argument to be made that it might not really be worth it?
No, I think it's absolutely worth it. If we're people who care about the truth, and I think we can find that the truth is more complicated than any one discipline can maybe sort of fully appreciate. And I think it takes time to understand how these different tools work, so that you can have these kinds of friendships and relationships across different disciplines to get at a more complete and accurate picture of reality, right? That's one of the things that's sort of fundamentally animating me is I'm concerned about the truth. And I want to know what the truth is. And I'm increasingly appreciating the fact that in order to do that, I have to have friends in other disciplines who are of goodwill, who want to work with me in these kinds of projects.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some of the discoveries that you've made that have just been surprising to you using some of these integrated tools and collaborations?
Yeah, so it's been interesting to see the relationship between fields in like cognitive science of religion and religious epistemology. I was sort of surprised by how much fit there was between those two disciplines, and how sort of a nice story could be told to sort of weave those two things together. How you have these two fields that are seemingly evolving on their own separately in their own disciplines, but they're sort of gravitating onto similar points. And again, once you get them together, you're able to get a more complete picture of everything that's going on, right? So, religious philosophers might talk about, properly basic religious beliefs. But what does that properly basic mean? What does that look like empirically? Well, now the cognitive science of religion can tell us a bit more about why some of these religious beliefs seem so basic to us, seem so fundamental to how we engage with the world. And so we're getting just a more complete picture of how humans engage with the world and how we think about things like gods and how we form beliefs about about the divine, the afterlife, souls, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Are there any other things that you think you would have just missed out on as far as your research process and discovery if you weren't working in this integrated way?
Well, I think one of the things I would have missed out on is all the. I mean, here's one way to think of it. I mean, this might sound like a negative, but it's absolutely a positive. It's all the objections to some of my own work that I could find in pure empirical research. Right. So, I've done a lot of work in virtue epistemology, and thinking about virtue theoretic models for human knowledge and engaging with the world and so on and so forth. But many of the traditional models for thinking about intellectual virtues need to be updated in light of empirical research. Right. Empirical research seemingly shows that humans may not have stable dispositions like we might have traditionally understood, right? And if that's the case, right, the jury's still out on that. But if that's the case, then that gives us a reason to update and revise how we think about intellectual virtues. And so, without that kind of integration, I might be naively sort of progressing along a research project that is in some ways fundamentally broken because it's disconnected from the human person. I'm sort of creating this model for virtuous thought that applies to creatures that don't actually exist. Right. So now when it comes to, this kind of integration, I'm better able to appreciate what the empirical research is showing. And I think updates my own thinking, my own account in light of what we're seeing in the empirical research.
Yeah. Okay. So there are just things that you could be missing out there. Well, as we look to wrap up this conversation, what are some of the forward looking topics, questions, projects that you're wanting to move forward in the world that have this integrated essence to them?
Yeah. Well, I would really like to continue to build bridges between philosophy of religion and experimental philosophy, and more broadly between philosophy of religion and the tools and resources of psychology, cognitive science, sociology, and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot of history of empirical tools and resources being hostile to philosophy of religion, and theists who are working within philosophy of religion. And so I think that history might make people a little gun shy about, seriously engaging with that empirical research because they think it might be sort of innately hostile to the kind of work that they're wanting to do, or it might be hostile to their sort of central convictions. And so one of the things I'm trying to do now is to sort of help build those bridges to help people see that that's not necessarily going to be the case, and that we need to have this kind of more complex conversation than we would be able to have otherwise. So that's one of my main goals right now, is to sort of, as we've launched experimental philosophy of religion as a field, to try to sort of continue to point to that and continue to build those bridges so that it sort of can achieve academic orbit, if you want to think of it that way.
Okay. Well, let me give you a chance to have the last word here. Is there anything else that comes to your mind that would be important for people to think about or consider about the importance of integration?
Yeah. Well, I would just sort of reiterate a point that I've already made, and just that if you care about the truth, then I think your inquiry simply has to be integrated. Right. It doesn't mean that people can't specialize in different fields, but I think by having collaboration across disciplines, we're able to get at a much better picture of the world. And I think that's just an incredibly important part of getting at the truth.
I love how you said that so casually too. Like, you decide what's important here, but if you care about the truth,
Yeah,
why
right.
are you do it?
Yep, but some people don't, right? There's some of that going around. Some people don't care about the truth, and so I think if we do, this is what we got to do.
If we do, this is what we got to do. You heard it here on Why It Matters Integration Unraveled today with Dr. Ian Church. Thank you so much, Ian, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I've been delighted to be here, and it's been an honor to be on the show.